Good to hear from a critical industry player like Microsoft, and great to see the strategic linkages to MEF work. Thank you, Sean, for presenting a clear overview of Azure for Operators. Now that we've seen things from the service provider and cloud provider point of view, it's time to push the edge and allow our analysts to weigh in. Stan Hubbard, Senior Director of Research and Analyst Relations, MEF's in-house analyst, recently conducted an interview with Grant Lenahan, Partner and Principal Analyst with Appledore Research. Let's listen in.
Welcome, Grant. It's a pleasure to have you join me today.
Well, thanks so much for having me here, Stan. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great. A couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to sit down with the board of MEF, a number of executives on the board, and have a roundtable discussion, looking at how the industry is evolving to address the enterprise digital transformation requirements. And, I think what we're seeing with that, with the board members, is there's a common understanding that enterprises are seeking an on-demand, secure, high-performance, low-latency experience when they're accessing their applications in the cloud. And that's regardless of whether that's in a hybrid, distributed, or multi-cloud environment. And, we had a couple of executives that shared their thoughts. Sean Hackle from Microsoft, Frank Morales from Orange Business Services, and they also agreed with others that, we need to see closer collaboration between the hyperscalers and the service providers to really address the enterprise requirements going forward. Because, the enterprises want a more seamless experience. They want to have a more resilient experience. And so with that as a backdrop, Grant, what do you see as some of the near-term opportunities for collaboration to deliver value to the enterprises?
Let's actually talk a little bit about not just the near term, but where we're going in the slightly longer term. And that's partly because there's a lot of, I think, what we can all maybe agree to as hype out there. And I'd like to debunk a little bit of the hype with the idea that just because you could do something technically doesn't mean you should. And yet I also don't want to cast a negative picture at all, because I think a lot of those use cases are going to be real in the slightly longer term. It's really a matter of timing. The other thing is we did a huge amount of research on this between over, let's say, the past 18 to 20 months. And one of the things that, I think I went in with some of the hype giving me a negative reaction. And the more I talked to enterprises, the more I talked to industrial automation systems integrators, the more I became positive on the opportunities. I just became positive on very slightly different opportunities. And, I'd like to talk a little bit about those. Because when you look at some of the ones that get all the coverage in the press, it's things like self-driving cars, right? And the question is, well, do you really need that? Could you use low latency across the globe for that? Yeah, it could probably be helpful. Do you need it? Well, no. And more than that, you've got issues when the cost of a mistake is, say, a crumpled metal or injury. Do you want to take the risk of, reliability, perfect coverage, all of those sorts of things, and even cost? And this came to a head, I thought, in a nice public way when there was I think it was a Twitter debate or fight between Marcus Weldon of Bell Labs and Elon Musk, who probably needs no introduction, nor does Marcus, on that point, where Marcus was really arguing the art of the possible, and Elon was saying, yeah, we don't need that now. And by the way, we're not going to suffer the cost or the risks. And when we did our research, what we found is there are a lot of things happening today. But you need to think about the sort of boring things that make business run. Logistics and supply chain, optimization of equipment, ports and rail yards for inventory where Wi-Fi simply doesn't cut it, where, for example, giant cranes in a port cast huge radio shadows, right? And you, at the very least, need something like LTE, if not 5G. Vision systems for manufacturing. We've seen some very interesting announcements from major manufacturers in the Far East working with Microsoft and some radio manufacturers about how they are using MEC and private 5G to allow for inspections that really had to be done by human beings in the past and didn't scale very well. So there are a lot of use cases. There's money to be made. One of the things that you may take out of what I was just saying is lots and lots of those use cases sound very much like private networks. And in fact, most of them are private networks. So I think another thing that we need to get out of our head is that these use cases are going to be on the public 5G network, the same one that, we use and my new iPhone will work on. The other thing we need to get out of our head, I believe, is that the service providers by default will be the suppliers of all of this business. They may be very good managed services providers. They may own critical spectrum. They may have a great role to play. But I believe they need to fit into an ecosystem defined by the industrial automation giants, the Rockwells, the Bosches of the world, and the specialty ones that I don't know in oil and gas and rail yards. So it was actually really fascinating to go through this research, go in maybe thinking I was going to de-hype things and realizing I was just going to get educated in what reality actually looked like.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. I think there are lots of opportunities out there. And, one of the areas I think we can learn about the emerging opportunities is in things like proof of concepts, right? MEF has a proof of concept program, MEF 3.0 proof of concepts, and we look at quite a few of these new use cases, related to automation and, sort of this fourth industrial revolution type of opportunity. What would you say are some of the key challenges and opportunities for service providers to address in this era of the distributed enterprise, work from anywhere type of situation that they face now?
Sure. I think the first thing that brings up is the idea that we need to talk about the fact that there are many edges, right? And again, it's very, very sexy to talk about the mobile edge compute locations. And that will be a growing area, probably with the first workloads being the 5G network itself and some very, very time-critical apps. But as we talked about earlier, probably those will be small initially and growing over more of the medium term. But there are also other edges. There are regional edges, and there is something that I call the enterprise edge. You can think of the enterprise edge as kind of what used to be your service or edge or premises router in enterprise locations. And the old model of an enterprise, driven as much by technological necessity as desire, was a few large buildings, office buildings, factories, whatever, and data centers in them. And as I like to say, you locked your data in the basement in the data center and built a ring fence of firewalls and remote access servers around them. And you had a relatively small number of high capacity static links. And, you punched an occasional hole in the firewall for outsiders. That's being totally changed, right? And we have work from home. We have businesses that are distributed and global. We have more smaller branch offices. We have everything from retail to, local specialists needing to access and collaborate on data. We have apps now moving to public cloud. We have a lot of apps being provided as a service. And in fact, again, if I go back and show my age, 15 years ago, people were talking about things like mashups in the internet. And Bob Lucky had his smart alarm clock where it was going to check your calendar and check the weather and get you up at the right time to make it to work and pick up the coffee that you want. And we're really seeing the idea of mashups now. And much of this is being enabled by public cloud, edge cloud, apps that are run by third-party specialists and integrators on behalf of industry verticals. And some of the tools that are really becoming extremely demanded are SD-WAN and things like it, bandwidth on demand, the ability to rearrange your network, the ability for it to include public cloud, the ability for it to recombine as your dynamic supply chain changes. Think about Boeing. They build a plane with suppliers all over the world and they change models and the supply chain changes, right? So not only is it everywhere, but it's changing. Maybe it's a couple of years if you're building planes. Maybe it's a couple of months if you're doing something else. And, one of the things is that I believe the idea of security and cloud and transport are becoming inseparable and must become inseparable. We've been doing some research also in security, which is very interesting because we did not view ourselves at Appledore as security experts. And yet we saw a lot of the aspects of security needing what's happening in the broader cloud native network in terms of automation and models and machines doing things for consistent configuration. And this leads to things that MEF is doing that the minute I saw them, I said, that's the right idea. And one of them is the SASE service. Now, I don't know nearly as much about it as you do, but I'll give you my layman's view that you believe SASE is not a security thing. It is a component of an end-to-end service that has locations or multiple locations and quality of service guarantees and security guarantees, and they may be both user and application dependent. And so I think in putting that together and also dealing with some of the LSA APIs that are needed to make all of this happen, the MEF is going down some of the right paths, and that's not just an advertisement for you and your work. I think that's a very practical reality that the MEF has let real use cases drive it rather than pie-in-the-sky visions, and that's a very, very good thing.
Yeah. So one of the things I like to highlight for people that are tracking MEF and what we're doing is we don't just have standards, we don't just have certification programs, but we have executives at some of the leading service and technology companies really aligning around that vision of on-demand services that are orchestrated across automated and interconnected networks and that run all the way from the enterprise end user across the service providers to the cloud. And so that's been a really, really powerful story to take to the market. Going back to the discussion I had with with some of the service providers, there was quite a bit of talk about this blurring of the lines between cloud providers and service providers over the next 5 years or so. As the two communities evolve towards more of an automated platform that combines network, cloud, and security. So how do you expect the cloud and communications providers to evolve, say, over that similar time period, maybe 4 to 5 years? What do you expect there?
Well, I think we're beginning to see that work itself out in the marketplace right now. If you get back to the idea of dynamic networks, some of those locations are going to be public cloud providers. Many of those applications are going to be run by public cloud providers. Even some of the as a service are going to be provided by the big public cloud giants. And I believe that the service providers, the network service providers, are traditional employers and clients and such. I think they need to rethink their idea of what their future expansion opportunities and applications are, and think less of I'm going to provide some cool piece of software like Gmail or YouTube, and think more about how they are going to make this merging of many, many third-party components, the mashup, seamless. And a lot of that means having APIs to let lots of third parties integrate in so that you can orchestrate from headquarters to branch to public cloud to partner seamlessly and securely. I mean, I thought Lumen, they almost made me laugh, and yet it was so true. I loved it when they said that orchestration is their secret sauce. That's only something a telecom nerd would love, and yet it was absolutely true, and it told me they were thinking along the right lines. And that takes me to rethinking how we view network as a service. I think in the simplest case, it's a sales and operational model, right? You put up network that you can buy as a service, just like you can buy software as a service. But there's so much more, because once you abstract things and make them intent-driven and orderable behind an API, you've got a model for making your own internal operations, your own internal ability to create new products and services far more efficient and low cost, at lower maintenance, nice separation of concerns, all those things that software people talk about. And the other thing it does is it causes you to think about services not as technology, but through the eyes of your customer. So if you think about customer focus, lower cost, and the agility your customers want all rolled into one technology if only you could implement it. That to me is a pretty powerful and compelling argument, which is why I actually like to, on purpose, change the term to everything as a service, not network as a service.
Yeah. You touched on a lot of really important points there, and I'll just go back to this idea of the orchestration. You mentioned Lumen, and one of the things I've been involved in here recently over the last several months is looking at the LSO, the evolution of the LSO Sonata market opportunity. Right, LSO Sonata API is being used to orchestrate inter-provider services, and we've got more than 24 service providers already, and that we've engaged with that are looking at, well, either have LSO Sonata APIs in production or intending to implement them in production. We're expanding the discussions with a number of additional service providers. But what we're seeing is they're really embracing the APIs to address this customer experience, to accelerate the service rollout, to build a longer lasting relationship with a customer who can come back and more easily order services from them. If you're a seller, and if you're a buyer, if you're on the buyer side, there's some interesting advantages there. You can actually be more engaged in strategic planning, knowing that your services could be delivered much more rapidly than say the 30, 60, 90 days of the past. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, there. But that leads me to another question for you. When you look at the service providers out there, there are hundreds and hundreds of service providers around the world that are not quite ready for this on-demand world, right? They may not have updated their BSS and OSS systems to be able to actually turn and interface with other partners, right? They have to go through this modernization process internally. You think about the transformation that has to take place. It has to be a strategy. It has to be a service portfolio. It has to be a network transformation, having the right technologies, and the focus around the APIs to make it all happen in a more automated way. And then finally, the professionals that are building out that next generation network. So what would your advice be for these companies as they think about moving along this journey towards that more automated future, the on-demand services, the closer collaboration with the cloud providers?
Well, I think you've already touched on a number of the important points right in the question, that it is a journey, right? That automation and simple interfacing are going to be a couple of the key attributes of it. And the first thing is, yes, not everyone is, China Telecom or Verizon or AT&T or Deutsche or BT or any of the giants. But I believe every operator has a play. They may have a local or regional play. They may have a play as the regional partner of one of the giants serving pan-global companies, right? Because, AT&T doesn't have loops in Botswana, right? So they need to work with companies there. And that's where things like Sonata APIs become so useful. But I believe everyone has a play, first of all. And the play will be targeted to, where you are, the characteristics of business where you are. And frankly, being local is huge in understanding that, because one size doesn't fit all, right? But I would say that is not a leave to be complacent. I think companies have to evolve or be marginalized. And I'm saying marginalized, not evolve or be dead, right? Because service providers, I do think, need to remember and always have chin up that you have some fantastic assets. In some cases, a legal license, right? But in other cases, you own spectrum, you own right-of-way, you have very, very difficult embedded plant with towers and concrete and buried facilities that, Google tried getting into the fiber business and found out this concrete and ditch witch stuff was hard, right? So keep that in mind and start asking, how do I build over time, as you said, right? It's not going to happen overnight. Operations that are agile for your customer and efficient for you, right? It sounds boring, but in many ways we can view it in a very sexy light, right? Because the fundamentals of really efficient operation come out of control theory, and control theory comes out of rocket science. So we can all be rocket scientists. And the reason I bring that up is everyone's scared of what sound like scary new technologies. And yet, if you look at at control theory. And you look at things as old as good old negative feedback loops. They actually lift an entire layer of complexity and pre-engineering off of projects and allow things to be far less maintenance intensive, far less code intensive. If you just keep it simple, you get something that works and you don't need to anticipate everything that's coming down the line. And that sort of brings me to, so how do you get there incrementally? And, you mentioned it's going to take time, it's going to take years, and it will. Well, what's really causing this change, right, is not that we suddenly got smart on operation systems. It's that the new technology, cloud technology, SDN technology, the incredibly flexible radio technology gives us knobs to twiddle that we've never had before. It wasn't possible to set things up and tear them down. To move a network function from here to there, that took wrenches and trucks and guys and gals that knew what they were doing. Now it can be done with a script. So let your operations follow your technology modernization. Focus on a good technology-specific domain manager for each domain as you modernize it. Then bring them together with a federated end-to-end orchestration and surveillance layer. And I like to say rent to own, right? Where you are paying a little bit every year as you modernize your network. But you said it at the very beginning, you have to have that long-term goal. You have to have the architecture so that everything's built consistently and each dollar you invest is not wasted and respent later, but getting you one step closer to where you're going. And again, I'll emphasize that if you build things with APIs, both TM Forum APIs and the API specifics that are being defined by the MEF in many, many areas, if you think of end-to-end services that have characteristics of transport and security and on-demand, and very practical things like ELAN and E-line and automation of those, you're slowly going to build your way there. And that has to, back to the comment of how's it going to work out between the public cloud and the telcos, the more cost effective and labor effective and therefore well-priced you are, the greater your role in any ecosystem is going to be. So get the fundamentals right, and I believe the profits and the margins and the place in the ecosystem will follow. And it's something we preach.
Yeah, well said, Grant. Lots of great advice there for the service providers. I think, in addition to the technology being available, we also have this sort of forced acceleration of the digital transformation, right, created by the whole COVID situation, right? Everybody having to condense their digital transformation into months instead of years. But I wanted to get sort of turn to like the enterprise side of things. What advice would you give for an enterprise as they're looking for service providers who can help them on their journey? What are the top things that they should consider? Well, we talked about things like automation and the shift towards on-demand services, many not quite there, but what would you say the enterprises really should look for in their service provider partners?
Well, I think they need to recognize that it's a journey for both them and for the service providers. So I believe a service provider needs to be honest about the fact that they're at a given point in time, but have a very clear plan as to where they're going. And that plan has to include portal-driven, right? Because everyone wants the ability to order and change things and monitor things cheaply and directly. It has to be relatively on demand. It's got to be flexible so that as you change from one partner to another, one supplier of cloud to another, and stitch things together, it is very likely to be included. So I would ask questions like, explain to me how you're going to orchestrate security end-to-end across me and my partners. And by the way, tell me how new technologies and new partners get added. If it's, we have a contract group that may contact them someday and come up with an 80-page contract, that's not a great answer. It's, we have an API and standard T's and C's, and you can onboard yourself and put your service in our catalog. That's the company I want to talk to, because I don't know what my business is going to look like in 3 years. but I know that I need you to help me connect it, right? So I think it's looking for flexibility and looking for an honest assessment of where they are today and how they're going to get where they need to be in a few years.
Very good. I really appreciate your balanced answers here. The comment I think of earlier where you talked about a service provider, they can basically embrace or become marginalized this future as opposed to dying off. But you offer the same type of balanced thinking when it comes to the enterprises as they go out and engage with their service provider partners. So really appreciate that, Grant, and really enjoyed the conversation with you. Thanks a lot.
I enjoyed this very much, Dan. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. And if I can just get one comment in on what you said, I remember about 15 years ago, the idea was the internet was going to kill the telecom providers. And as Mark Twain said, the reports of their death have been greatly exaggerated. So yeah. I think they will overcome this. Just embrace it rather than defend against it.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.